The Silent Warriors. The night sky over Normandy on June 5, 1944, was alive with a peculiar sound, or rather, the absence of one. While the roar of aircraft engines filled the darkness, another kind of aircraft swept through the clouds with an eerie silence that would forever change the nature of warfare. These were the gliders, the silent wings of World War II, carrying brave paratroopers into the heart of enemy territory. Their story, often overshadowed by the more dramatic tales of D-Day's beach landings, represents one of the most ingenious and daring innovations in military history. This is not just another war story. This is the untold saga of how engineers, pilots, and soldiers transformed what was essentially a sporting aircraft into a weapon of war. How they identified and utilized drop zones with scientific precision, and how these wooden and canvas constructions became instrumental in some of the war's most pivotal moments. From the drawing boards of desperate military planners to the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific, the story of World War II gliders and their crews reveals innovation born of necessity, courage in the face of overwhelming odds, and ingenuity that would influence military strategies for generations to come.
The birth of an idea. The concept of using gliders for military purposes didn't emerge overnight. In the years leading up to World War II, aviation enthusiasts and military strategists had been contemplating the possibilities of unpowered flight. The glider, after all, had existed since the late 19th century, when pioneers like Otto Lilienthal first took to the skies suspended beneath fabric wings. By the 1920s and 1930s, gliding had become a popular sport in Europe, particularly in Germany, where the Treaty of Versailles had severely restricted powered aircraft development. It was this very restriction that inadvertently gave Germany a head start in military glider development. German engineers, forbidden from building combat aircraft, turned their attention to gliders as both a sporting pursuit and a covert way to train pilots. By the mid-1930s, Germany had developed a sophisticated gliding culture, with thousands of trained glider pilots and advanced understanding of unpowered flight dynamics. When the Nazi regime began openly rearming in the late 1930s, this foundation proved invaluable. The first true military demonstration of glider warfare came not in a major battle, but in a daring raid that shocked the world. On May 10, 1940, German forces launched Operation Fall Gelb, the invasion of Belgium and France. As part of this offensive, a small force of elite German paratroopers and glider-borne troops executed what many military historians consider the first successful airborne assault in history. Their target was Fort Eben Emiel, a massive Belgian fortress considered virtually impregnable to conventional attack. The fortress, located at the junction of the Albert Canal and the Meuse River, was a masterpiece of military engineering. Its thick concrete walls and strategic position made it a linchpin of Belgium's defenses. Belgian commanders were confident that any German assault would be costly and time-consuming, buying precious days for Allied forces to mobilize. They were wrong. In the early morning hours of May 10th, 9 DFS-230 gliders, each carrying 10 men and towed by Junkers U-52 transport aircraft, silently descended onto the roof of Fort Eben Emiel. The defenders never saw them coming. The sound of the tow planes had faded as the gliders were released miles away, and the canvas and steel constructions touched down with minimal noise. Within minutes, German engineers were placing specially designed shaped charges against the fortress's gun emplacements and observation cupolas. The assault was devastating in its efficiency. Using hollow charge explosives, a relatively new technology at the time, the German troops systematically disabled the fort's defenses. The 1,200-man Belgian garrison, demoralized and disoriented by the unexpected attack from above, surrendered after just 24 hours. The Germans had achieved in one day what conventional forces might have taken weeks to accomplish, if they could have done it at all. More importantly, they had demonstrated a new kind of warfare that military planners around the world could not ignore. The success at Eben Emael sent shockwaves through Allied military headquarters. If a modern fortress could be taken so quickly by glider-borne troops, what other impregnable positions were suddenly vulnerable? British Prime Minister Winston Churchill immediately recognized the strategic implications. Within weeks, he issued a memo demanding that Britain develop its own airborne forces, stating, "We ought to have a corps of at least 5,000 parachute troops." This directive would lead to the formation of Britain's glider and paratrooper forces. In the United States, military observers watched these developments with keen interest, though America's entry into the war was still more than a year away. The U.S. Army had experimented with parachute troops as early as 1940, but the glider concept was slower to take hold. American military tradition emphasized mobility and firepower, and the idea of sending troops into battle in unarmed, unpowered aircraft seemed almost suicidal to many commanders. However, the strategic advantages were undeniable. Gliders could carry more men and heavier equipment than parachute drops could. While a paratrooper could carry only what he could jump with, typically his personal weapon, ammunition, and basic supplies, a glider could transport jeeps, anti-tank guns, medical supplies, and even small artillery pieces. This meant that glider-borne forces could arrive at their objectives with significantly more combat power than paratroopers alone. The development programs that followed in Britain and America represented a massive undertaking. Engineers had to design gliders that could be mass-produced quickly and cheaply, yet strong enough to survive combat landings. They had to be large enough to carry meaningful payloads, but light enough to be towed by existing transport aircraft. The materials had to be readily available, as strategic metals and resources were in short supply. Most challenging of all, these aircraft had to be capable of landing in fields, pastures, and other improvised landing zones without the benefit of prepared runways.
Designing the silent wings. The engineering challenges faced by glider designers were immense and often contradictory. The aircraft needed to be sturdy enough to withstand rough landings in unprepared terrain, yet light enough to be towed effectively. They had to be spacious enough to carry troops and equipment, but streamlined enough to glide efficiently. And they had to be simple enough to be manufactured by furniture makers and small contractors, as aircraft factories were already operating at maximum capacity, producing bombers and fighters. In Britain, the solution came in the form of the airspeed Horsa, named after the legendary Saxon warrior who invaded Britain in the 5th century. The Horsa was a high-wing monoplane constructed primarily of wood, with a fabric covering over much of its surface. Its design was both elegant and practical, featuring a wingspan of 88 feet and a length of 67 feet. The glider could carry up to 28 fully equipped troops, or a combination of troops and cargo, including a jeep, an anti-tank gun, or motorcycle combinations. The Horsa's most ingenious feature was its nose section, which was hinged and could be swung open to allow rapid unloading of vehicles and cargo. This design meant that, unlike conventional aircraft, loading and unloading didn't require maneuvering equipment through a narrow side door. A jeep could be driven straight out of the front of the aircraft, saving precious minutes during combat operations. The tail section could also be jettisoned in flight if necessary, providing another emergency exit point. Manufacturing the Horsa became a national effort. Over 3,600 were eventually built, not by traditional aircraft companies, but by furniture manufacturers who possessed the woodworking skills necessary for the glider's construction. Harris Labus, a London furniture maker, became one of the primary contractors. This distributed manufacturing approach meant that even if a factory was bombed, production could continue elsewhere. It also freed up traditional aircraft factories to focus on powered aircraft production. American designers took a different approach. The Waco CG-4A, which became the U.S. military's primary assault glider, was similar in size to the Horsa, but incorporated different design philosophies. The CG-4As featured an upward-hinged nose section that allowed for front-loading, and its steel tube fuselage frame covered with fabric made it somewhat more durable than its British counterpart. With a wingspan of 83 feet and capable of carrying 13 fully equipped troops or a cargo load including a jeep, an anti-tank gun, or motorcycle combinations, the CG-4As was slightly smaller than the Horsa, but shared the same basic concept. The CG-4A's development story reflects the industrial might that America would bring to bear on the war effort. 16 companies eventually manufactured the glider, producing over 13,900 units. These ranged from established aircraft companies to automakers, furniture manufacturers, and even casket makers. Ford Motor Company, applying its assembly line techniques to glider production, could turn out multiple CG-4As per day at peak production. But perhaps the most ambitious glider design of the war was the British Hamilcar, a true heavy-lift assault glider designed specifically to carry tanks into battle. With a wingspan of 110 feet and a cargo capacity of 17,500 pounds, the Hamilcar could transport a Tetrarch light tank, or 2 universal carriers, along with their crews. This massive wooden aircraft represented the ultimate expression of the glider concept, an entire armored fighting vehicle delivered silently to the battlefield. The engineering tolerances required for these gliders were remarkably tight considering their construction methods. The wings had to be precisely shaped to provide consistent lift characteristics. The control surfaces needed to be responsive enough for precise maneuvering during the approach to landing zones, yet not so sensitive that they would be difficult to control in the turbulent air often encountered during towed flight. The landing gear had to be robust enough to withstand landing on rough terrain, yet retractable or jettisonable to reduce drag during flight. One of the most challenging aspects of glider design was the tow system. The gliders were connected to their tow aircraft, typically Douglas C-47 Skytrains in the American forces or Armstrong-Whitworth Albemarle bombers in the British forces, by a nylon rope several hundred feet long. This rope had to be strong enough to withstand the forces generated during takeoff and flight, yet have enough elasticity to absorb shocks and prevent the glider from being torn apart by sudden changes in the tow plane's speed or direction. The relationship between tow plane and glider was delicate and required constant attention from both pilots. The glider pilot had to maintain proper position relative to the tow aircraft, typically flying slightly above and to one side to avoid the turbulent wake. If the glider pilot allowed his aircraft to drop too low, it would enter the tow plane's slipstream and experience violent buffeting. Too high, and the glider would create additional drag on the tow plane, potentially forcing it into a stall. Engineers also had to address the problem of release mechanisms. The glider pilot needed to be able to quickly disconnect from the tow plane at the appropriate moment, which might be at high altitude and several miles from the landing zone, or at low altitude if the tow plane came under fire. The release mechanism had to be absolutely reliable, as a failure to disconnect could result in the glider being dragged into enemy territory or crashing when the tow plane landed. The cockpit layout and controls of military gliders were another area requiring careful thought. Unlike powered aircraft, gliders had no engines to provide electrical power, so all instruments had to be either mechanical or wind-powered. The basic flight instruments, airspeed indicator, altimeter, compass, and turn-and-bank indicator, were essential for navigation and safe flight, especially when flying through clouds or at night. Some gliders were equipped with simple radios for communication with the tow plane, but these were battery-powered and had limited range. Safety features were necessarily minimal. Gliders had no engines to provide thrust for a go-around if the first landing approach wasn't successful. Once released from the tow plane, the glider was committed to landing somewhere, hopefully at the intended landing zone. To help reduce landing distance, most gliders were equipped with spoilers, large panels that could be extended from the wings to disrupt the airflow and increase drag. These allowed pilots to descend steeply without building up excessive speed, critical when landing in small fields surrounded by obstacles.
Training the glider pilots. Flying a glider into combat required a unique combination of skills, and perhaps more importantly, a particular mindset. Glider pilots needed the technical proficiency of powered aircraft pilots combined with the judgment and situational awareness of a seasoned soaring enthusiast, all wrapped up with the courage to fly into combat in an unarmed, unpowered aircraft that offered no chance of escape if things went wrong. The training programs developed for glider pilots in both Britain and America reflected these demands. In the United States, the Army Air Forces established glider training schools across the country, primarily in regions with favorable weather and suitable terrain. These schools attracted a diverse group of volunteers, from civilian glider enthusiasts to washed-out pilot trainees to soldiers from other branches seeking the adventure and prestige of being a glider pilot. The training regimen was rigorous and progressive. Initial training focused on basic glider handling using small, single-seat training gliders. Students learned the fundamentals of coordinated turns, stall recognition and recovery, and the critical art of energy management. Unlike powered aircraft pilots who could add power to extend flight time or recover from mistakes, glider pilots had to constantly think ahead, planning their approach and landing from the moment they released from the tow plane. As training progressed, students moved to larger, dual-control gliders where they flew with instructors. Here they learned the complexities of formation flying, instrument flying, and night operations. Formation flying was particularly challenging in gliders, as maintaining position relative to both the tow plane and other gliders required constant attention and precise control inputs. The turbulence generated by multiple aircraft in close proximity created a constantly shifting environment that demanded complete focus. One of the most challenging aspects of training was learning to land in confined spaces. Unlike conventional aircraft that typically landed on prepared runways, glider pilots had to be prepared to set down in fields, pastures, or any open space large enough to accommodate their aircraft. Training fields were deliberately chosen to simulate combat conditions, with obstacles, rough terrain, and limited approach paths. Instructors would often wait for windy or turbulent conditions to conduct training, knowing that combat operations wouldn't be postponed due to weather. Night landings presented their own unique challenges. In combat, gliders would often approach landing zones with only minimal lighting, perhaps just a few small fires or flashlights to mark the field boundaries. Training exercises replicated these conditions, with students learning to judge their altitude and distance by the appearance of the ground in moonlight or starlight. The sensation of descending toward a darkened field, unable to use engine power to correct mistakes, required iron nerves and complete trust in one's training and judgment. Perhaps the most distinctive aspect of glider pilot training was the acceptance of a one-way mission profile. Unlike bomber crews who could return to base after their mission, or fighter pilots who could land at friendly airfields, glider pilots knew that their aircraft would be abandoned after landing. They would become ground troops, fighting alongside the soldiers they had delivered. This reality shaped the psychological profile of glider pilots. They were volunteers who accepted that they were as much infantrymen as aviators. The British training program, centered at RAF Shobden and other locations, followed a similar philosophy, but with some differences reflecting Britain's earlier entry into the war and different operational requirements. British glider pilots underwent more extensive infantry training, as they were expected to serve as full members of the airborne units they supported. They were trained in weapons handling, small unit tactics, and even survival skills for operating behind enemy lines. One unique aspect of the British program was the emphasis on emergency procedures and crash survival. British instructors, drawing on early combat experience, realized that a significant percentage of glider landings would result in accidents or damage to the aircraft. Students were taught how to brace for impact, how to evacuate damaged gliders quickly, and how to assess and treat injuries sustained during landing. This realistic approach undoubtedly saved many lives in combat operations. Training casualties were significant, highlighting the inherent dangers of the program. Tow rope failures, misjudged landings, mid-air collisions during formation training, and structural failures all claimed lives during the training period. In the United States alone, over 200 glider pilots died in training accidents between 1942 and 1945. These losses were quietly absorbed, considered an acceptable cost of developing the capability that would prove essential in major operations. The psychological preparation of glider pilots was as important as the technical training. Instructors and commanding officers emphasized the historical significance of airborne operations, drawing parallels to legendary military units and operations. Glider pilots were told they were joining an elite fraternity, that their role would be pivotal in the war's outcome. This wasn't mere propaganda. The strategic importance of airborne operations meant that glider pilots would indeed play crucial roles in some of the war's most significant battles. Equipment familiarization was another critical component of training. Glider pilots had to become intimately familiar with every aspect of their aircraft, from the release mechanism and control systems to the cargo loading procedures and emergency equipment. They learned how to quickly assess damage after landing and determine if the glider could be used as a defensive position or if it should be abandoned immediately. They practiced loading and unloading procedures until they could accomplish them in darkness and under simulated enemy fire. By the time glider pilots completed their training and received their wings, they had logged dozens of hours in the air and countless more in ground school, physical training, and infantry exercises. They were among the most versatile soldiers in the military, capable of performing the demanding task of piloting their aircraft into combat and then immediately transitioning to ground combat operations. The silver wings with the distinctive G in the center became a badge of honor, representing skills and courage that set these men apart.
The science of drop zones. Selecting and preparing drop zones for glider operations was a complex undertaking that combined geography, intelligence, tactical planning, and engineering in equal measure. Unlike parachute drops, which could be executed over relatively small areas with troops scattered across a wide zone, glider operations required landing zones with specific characteristics. These requirements often conflicted with tactical needs, creating challenges that required innovative solutions. The ideal glider landing zone had several essential characteristics. It needed to be relatively flat and free of obstacles such as poles, fences, large rocks, or ditches that could damage the gliders during landing. The surface needed to be firm enough to prevent the gliders from bogging down, but not so hard that the landing impact would be excessive. The field needed to be large enough to accommodate multiple gliders landing in quick succession, typically requiring at least 400 yards of clear space, though longer was always preferable. And critically, it needed to be within reasonable distance of the tactical objective, as glider troops would be fighting with only the equipment they could carry or push in their vehicles. Finding such locations in enemy-occupied territory was a monumental task. Allied intelligence services employed every available resource to identify suitable landing zones. High-altitude reconnaissance photography provided detailed images of potential sites, which analysts studied using stereoscopic viewers to assess terrain features that might not be apparent in standard photographs. The angle of shadows, patterns in vegetation, and variations in soil color all provided clues about the suitability of potential landing zones. Resistance fighters and intelligence agents operating behind enemy lines provided invaluable ground-level information about potential landing zones. They could confirm whether photographs showed actual obstacles or shadows, report on soil conditions after rain, identify enemy positions near potential landing zones, and observe patterns of enemy patrols and defensive positions. This human intelligence often made the difference between selecting a marginally suitable landing zone and identifying one that would maximize the chance of mission success. But identifying suitable landing zones was only the first step. Allied planners then had to assess the defensive positions surrounding potential sites. Landing zones too close to enemy strongpoints would result in gliders being destroyed as they approached or immediately after landing. Zones too far from defensive positions might be safer during landing, but would require long, vulnerable approaches to objectives, giving enemies time to organize resistance. The balance between landing safety and tactical positioning required careful calculation.
Weather considerations added another layer of complexity to landing zone selection. Wind direction and speed were critical factors, as gliders needed to land into the wind to minimize ground speed and landing distance. Planners had to consider seasonal weather patterns, typical wind conditions at different times of day, and the likelihood of fog or low clouds that might obscure landing zones. For major operations planned months in advance, meteorologists could only provide statistical probabilities, not definite forecasts. Terrain features near landing zones could work for or against the operation. Woods and forests could provide cover for troops assembling after landing, but also concealed enemy positions. Rivers and streams might channel approaching gliders into predictable paths, making them easier targets, but also could serve as rallying points and navigation aids. Hedgerows, common in the Normandy region, created natural obstacles but also provided defensive positions once troops had landed. Once a landing zone was selected, preparations often began months before the operation. Allied planners created detailed maps and photographs that glider pilots would study until they could recognize the landing zone from any direction. Sand table models, some large enough to walk around, allowed pilots and troops to visualize the three-dimensional layout of landing zones and surrounding areas. These models incorporated every known detail, from individual buildings and trees to suspected enemy positions. Pathfinder teams played a crucial role in landing zone preparation. These elite units would parachute into landing zones shortly before the main glider force arrived, tasked with marking the zones and providing guidance to incoming gliders. Pathfinders carried specialized equipment, including radio beacons that glider pilots could home in on, lights or flares to mark field boundaries, and sometimes even crude landing tees fashioned from canvas or other materials to indicate wind direction. The Eureka-Rebecca system represented one of the most sophisticated landing zone marking technologies of the war. Pathfinders would set up Eureka radar transponder beacons at landing zones, while glider pilots carried Rebecca radar receivers in their cockpits. The Rebecca unit would display a signal indicating the direction and approximate distance to the Eureka beacon, allowing pilots to navigate directly to the landing zone even in darkness or low visibility. This system, while not foolproof, significantly improved landing accuracy compared to pure visual navigation. The timing of glider operations relative to landing zone preparation was critical. Ideally, pathfinders would have time to fully survey the landing zone, identify and mark obstacles, and set up comprehensive marking systems before gliders arrived. In practice, this was rarely possible. Pathfinders often jumped just minutes before gliders arrived, racing against time to complete their preparations while under potential enemy fire. Some operations saw pathfinders unable to reach their assigned landing zones due to navigation errors or enemy interference, leaving glider pilots to land without any ground-based guidance. Landing zone preparations sometimes included deliberate deception operations. Allied planners would conduct reconnaissance flights over multiple potential landing zones, hoping to keep German forces uncertain about the actual target. In some cases, dummy paratroopers, mannequins with fireworks attached, were dropped far from actual landing zones to draw enemy forces away from the real objectives. These deception efforts weren't always successful, but they contributed to overall operational security and sometimes succeeded in confusing enemy responses. The Germans, aware of Allied glider capabilities after 1940, made their own preparations to counter glider operations. Rommel's asparagus became a common sight across occupied Europe. Tall poles erected in fields and meadows that might serve as landing zones. These poles, sometimes with cables strung between them, were designed to destroy gliders attempting to land there. In some cases, entire fields were littered with obstacles, from logs and ditches to actual explosives. Allied intelligence worked constantly to identify and map these defenses, requiring last-minute changes to landing zone selection. The French countryside's bocage terrain presented unique challenges. These fields, surrounded by ancient earthen banks topped with thick hedgerows and trees, created natural barriers that were nearly invisible from the air but could be deadly to gliders. A field that looked perfect from reconnaissance photographs might be surrounded by banks 6 feet high and hedgerows another 6 feet tall, creating barriers that would destroy any glider attempting to land there. Identifying these features from aerial photographs required expert interpretation and often relied on intelligence from locals.
The first major operations. The first large-scale Allied glider operations came in July 1943 with Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily.
This operation represented a crucial test of Allied airborne doctrine and would provide hard lessons about glider operations that would influence all subsequent planning. The operation called for American and British airborne forces to seize key objectives inland from the beach landing zones, disrupting enemy communications and preventing reinforcements from reaching the beaches. The American portion of the operation involved 144 CG-4A gliders, carrying elements of the 82nd Airborne Division. The gliders, towed by C-47 transport aircraft, approached Sicily from the south, flying over the Mediterranean at night. The plan called for the gliders to release several miles offshore and glide to their landing zones near Gela. In theory, this approach would allow the tow planes to remain out of range of heavy anti-aircraft fire while still delivering troops accurately to their objectives. What followed demonstrated that theory and practice could diverge dramatically in combat. The tow pilots, many of whom were inexperienced in night formation flying over water, struggled to maintain cohesion. Navigation errors and high winds scattered the formations. As the formations approached Sicily, they encountered a mix of Allied naval vessels firing at anything in the air, nervous gunners uncertain about friend or foe, and German anti-aircraft positions ashore. Several tow planes were hit, and panicked pilots released their gliders prematurely. Of the 144 American gliders launched, only 54 landed on Sicily at all. Many released too far from shore and ditched in the Mediterranean, with troops struggling ashore in full gear or being rescued by Allied vessels. Those that made it to Sicily often landed miles from their intended zones, scattered across the southeastern part of the island. Some landed near enemy positions and were engaged immediately upon touching down. Others landed in rocky terrain that damaged the gliders and injured occupants. Yet despite this chaotic dispersal, the American glider troops managed to achieve many of their objectives through small unit initiative and determination. The British glider operation fared somewhat better, though still far from the planned outcome. The British 1st Airborne Division dispatched 8 Waco gliders and 136 Horsa gliders to seize the Ponte Grande Bridge south of Syracuse. The bridge was a critical objective. Its capture would allow rapid movement of ground forces northward and prevent its demolition by retreating Italian forces. Like their American counterparts, the British formations encountered navigation difficulties and anti-aircraft fire. High winds further complicated matters, and many pilots released early when they believed they were over land. Approximately 69 of the 136 Horsas and half of the Wacos landed in the sea, resulting in significant casualties. However, sufficient numbers of gliders landed near the bridge to capture it in the initial assault, though Italian counterattacks later retook it before British ground forces arrived to secure it permanently. The Sicily operation revealed critical flaws in Allied airborne planning and execution. Navigation over water at night proved far more difficult than anticipated. Tow pilots needed better training in formation flying and navigation. Recognition systems needed improvement to prevent friendly fire from naval vessels. And the influence of wind on gliders had been significantly underestimated in planning calculations. But Sicily also demonstrated the potential value of glider operations when conditions were more favorable. The psychological impact of troops landing behind enemy lines was substantial. Italian and German forces had to divert units to deal with scattered glider troops, reducing the forces available to oppose the beach landings. Even gliders that landed far from their intended zones tied down enemy forces and created confusion. The lessons learned in Sicily would prove invaluable in planning subsequent operations. Less than a year after Sicily, the Allies launched their most ambitious airborne operation to date, the assault on Normandy. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, hundreds of gliders carried British and American troops to landing zones behind the beaches where history's largest amphibious invasion would soon occur. The stakes could not have been higher, and the planning that went into the glider operations reflected the lessons learned in Sicily and subsequent operations. The British 6th Airborne Division's glider operation began in the pre-dawn hours with one of the most daring missions of the war. 6 Horsa gliders, carrying a reinforced company of the 2nd Battalion, Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, took off from England with specific objectives: capture intact 2 bridges over the Caen Canal and Orne River. These bridges, codenamed Pegasus and Horsa, were critical to the success of the entire British landing on Sword Beach. If German armor could cross these bridges, they could strike directly at the invasion beaches. If the bridges were demolished, British forces would be unable to advance inland. Major John Howard commanded the operation, and he had trained his men relentlessly for this specific mission. The glider pilots had practiced landing in confined spaces at night, and the troops had rehearsed the assault on the bridges using detailed mock-ups.
As the 6 gliders released from their tow planes over the Normandy coast, the pilots executed what would later be described as some of the most precise flying of the entire war. The lead glider, piloted by Staff Sergeant Jim Walworth, descended through the darkness toward the Caen Canal Bridge. Walworth could barely make out the bridge and surrounding terrain in the moonlight, but his repeated practice and intimate knowledge of the target area allowed him to judge his approach. The glider touched down less than 50 yards from the bridge. The screech of wood on Norman soil broke the night silence. The second glider landed moments later, and within seconds troops were pouring out, racing toward the bridge before the stunned German defenders could react. The assault was over in minutes. The bridge was captured with only 2 British casualties, and before the German garrison fully understood what was happening, the objective was secure. The other 3 gliders landed near the Orne River Bridge, which was similarly captured in a swift assault. These 2 bridges remained in British hands throughout the battle, playing exactly the role planned for them in the invasion's success. The precision of the glider landings, some of the most accurate of the entire war, made this outcome possible. Later on D-Day, larger glider operations delivered reinforcements and heavy equipment to the British airborne troops. Hamilcar gliders brought in Tetrarch tanks and anti-tank guns, providing the firepower needed to hold against German armored counterattacks. American glider operations on the Cotentin Peninsula, while not as precise as the British bridge assault, successfully delivered thousands of troops and critical equipment to reinforce the paratroopers who had jumped earlier. The success of D-Day's glider operations vindicated the concept and the years of development and training. Commanders on both sides recognized that these silent wings had played a crucial role in the invasion's success. German reports after the battle acknowledged the effectiveness of the Allied airborne forces in disrupting communications, seizing key terrain, and preventing rapid concentration of defensive forces.
Operation Market Garden in September 1944, proposed by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, was perhaps the most ambitious airborne operation ever conceived. The plan called for dropping 3.5 airborne divisions, British, American, and Polish, to seize a series of bridges across the Netherlands, creating a corridor through which British armored forces could advance rapidly into Germany, potentially ending the war by Christmas. The operation would involve the largest deployment of gliders in history. Over 1,000 gliders would deliver troops, vehicles, and equipment to landing zones stretching from Eindhoven in the south to Arnhem in the north. The scope and complexity of the operation strained Allied airborne forces to their limits, requiring precise coordination between airborne and ground forces. The American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were assigned objectives in the southern portion of the corridor, capturing bridges at Eindhoven, Grave, and Nijmegen. The British 1st Airborne Division received the most distant and challenging objective, the bridge over the Rhine at Arnhem. If successful, the operation would outflank German defensive lines and open a path into the industrial heart of Germany. The glider operations began on September 17, 1944, with hundreds of gliders lifting off from airfields across southern England. Unlike the night operations that had characterized previous airborne assaults, Market Garden launched in daylight, allowing for more accurate navigation, but also exposing the gliders to anti-aircraft fire throughout their approach. The sight of this massive armada, transport aircraft, gliders, and escorting fighters, stretched across dozens of miles of sky, an awe-inspiring display of Allied air power. The American glider operations in the south achieved most of their objectives, despite scattered landings and German resistance. Gliders delivered jeeps, anti-tank guns, and additional troops to reinforce the paratroopers who had jumped ahead of them. The bridges at Eindhoven and Nijmegen were captured, though the latter only after intense fighting that saw American paratroopers crossing the Wall River in boats under fire to take the northern end of the bridge. At Arnhem, however, the operation began to unravel. The British 1st Airborne Division faced multiple challenges from the start. The landing zones, selected for their suitability for glider operations, were located 8 miles from the bridge, a compromise driven by terrain limitations and intelligence assessments.
This distance meant that British forces had to advance through built-up areas where German forces could delay them. Unknown to Allied planners, 2 SS Panzer divisions were refitting near Arnhem, providing unexpectedly strong opposition. The glider troops who landed at Arnhem encountered immediate difficulties. Some landing zones came under fire as gliders touched down. The advance towards the bridge became a running battle through the streets of Arnhem and surrounding villages. Only a portion of the British force, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, reached the bridge where they established defensive positions at the northern end. For 4 days, Frost's men held the bridge against increasing German pressure, waiting for the British armored column to arrive from the south. Gliders continued to arrive, delivering reinforcements and supplies, but many landed in areas now under German control. Glider pilots, trained to fight as infantry, found themselves in desperate battles for survival even before they could join the main body of troops. The armored column that was supposed to advance rapidly up the corridor faced its own problems. German resistance at several points, including the bridge at Nijmegen, delayed the advance. The narrow Dutch roads, elevated above marshy polders on either side, created a bottleneck that limited the number of vehicles that could advance simultaneously. German forces, recovering from their initial surprise, organized effective blocking positions. By September 21st, with ammunition running low and casualties mounting, the situation at Arnhem had become desperate. Frost's force at the bridge was finally overwhelmed, and the remainder of the British 1st Airborne Division formed a defensive perimeter in the suburb of Oosterbeek. Resupply efforts by gliders and parachute drops largely failed, with supplies landing in German-held areas or being destroyed by enemy fire. The final act came on the night of September 25th, when the remnants of the British 1st Airborne Division withdrew across the Rhine under cover of darkness. Of approximately 10,000 men who had landed at Arnhem, only about 2,400 made it back to Allied lines. The operation, despite achieving most of its objectives in the southern portion of the corridor, ultimately failed to secure the critical bridge at Arnhem, prompting one of the operation's architects to later describe it as a bridge too far. The glider pilots at Arnhem demonstrated extraordinary courage and adaptability. Many found themselves cut off from their units, fighting as infantry in small groups or individually. Some glider pilots held defensive positions for days, their aviation training suddenly irrelevant as they became frontline soldiers. Others organized evacuation efforts, helping wounded troops reach medical facilities or escape routes. The casualty rate among glider pilots at Arnhem was proportionately higher than among the troops they had delivered. Market Garden provided valuable lessons about the limitations of airborne operations. The operation demonstrated that even massive airborne forces couldn't succeed without rapid link-up with ground forces. The distance between landing zones and objectives proved critical. Every mile troops had to advance on foot increased the time defenders had to organize resistance. The operation also revealed the challenges of maintaining resupply to isolated airborne forces, particularly when landing zones came under enemy control. Yet Market Garden also showcased the remarkable capabilities of glider-borne forces when properly employed. The American operations in the South demonstrated that gliders could deliver the firepower and mobility needed for complex tactical objectives. The precision landings and immediate aggressive action by glider troops at multiple locations created opportunities that might have succeeded with better coordination of ground forces. The courage and professionalism of glider pilots and troops under the most adverse conditions earned widespread recognition.
The Rhine crossing. As 1945 began, Allied forces prepared for the final push into Germany. The Rhine River represented the last major natural barrier protecting the German heartland, and crossing it would require massive coordination of ground, air, and airborne forces. Operation Varsity, launched on March 24, 1945, would be the largest single-day airborne operation in history, and gliders would play a central role. Unlike previous operations that had seen airborne forces dropped or landed ahead of ground forces, Varsity was designed as a coordinated assault with airborne troops landing simultaneously with the river crossing by conventional forces. This approach reflected lessons learned from Market Garden and earlier operations. Airborne forces were most effective when they could be rapidly reinforced and resupplied by ground units. The operation involved over 1,500 transport aircraft and 1,300 gliders, carrying the U.S. 17th Airborne Division and British 6th Airborne Division. The landing zones were located on the east bank of the Rhine near the town of Wessel. The objectives included capturing key bridges over the Isel River, seizing high ground overlooking the Rhine, and clearing the way for advancing ground forces. Planning for Varsity incorporated all the hard-won experience of previous operations. Landing zones were carefully selected to be close to objectives, minimizing the distance troops would have to advance on foot. The operation would be conducted in daylight to maximize navigation accuracy, with fighter cover provided to suppress anti-aircraft positions. Timing was coordinated so that preliminary bombardment would suppress defenses just before gliders landed, but not so far in advance that defenders would have time to recover. The morning of March 24th saw the massive aerial armada assemble over England and begin its flight toward Germany. The stream of aircraft stretched for hundreds of miles, an aerial procession that took hours to pass any given point. German defenders, aware that a major operation was imminent, had concentrated anti-aircraft weapons around likely landing areas. As the formations approached the Rhine, they flew into a storm of flak. The concentrated anti-aircraft fire was devastating. Transport aircraft and gliders were hit throughout the approach, some bursting into flames, others releasing their gliders prematurely to try to save both aircraft. Glider pilots found themselves descending through a sky filled with smoke, burning aircraft and tracers. Some tow planes, hit by flak, crashed while still connected to their gliders, dragging the unpowered aircraft down with them. The courage required to maintain formation and continue toward landing zones under such fire cannot be overstated. Despite the intense fire, most gliders reached their landing zones and delivered their troops and equipment. The precision of the landings, conducted in daylight and aided by visible ground references, was remarkably good. Units were able to assemble quickly and move toward their objectives. Hamilcar gliders delivered tanks and heavy equipment that proved crucial in the fighting that followed. American gliders brought in jeeps, artillery, and anti-tank weapons that gave the 17th Airborne Division the firepower to hold against German counterattacks. The British 6th Airborne Division, veterans of D-Day and other operations, executed their landings with professional efficiency. Their objectives included several villages and high ground east of the landing zones. Within hours of landing, British troops had secured most of their objectives, though fighting continued in some areas throughout the day. The presence of armor delivered by Hamilcar gliders proved decisive in several engagements, with German defensive positions that might have held against infantry falling quickly to tank fire. By the end of March 24th, both airborne divisions had achieved all their major objectives. The cost had been significant: 44 transport aircraft and gliders lost, with hundreds of casualties among air crews and troops, but the operation succeeded in its strategic purpose. The airborne forces seized and held key terrain that facilitated the ground forces' advance across the Rhine. Within days, Allied armor was pouring across the river and driving deep into Germany. Operation Varsity represented the culmination of glider warfare development. The aircraft, tactics, and training had reached their peak effectiveness. Commanders understood how to employ glider forces to maximum advantage. Pilots had refined their skills to the point where they could execute precision landings under combat conditions. The integration of glider operations with conventional ground operations had been mastered. Yet, Varsity would also mark the beginning of the end for combat gliders, as new technologies would soon make them obsolete.
The Pacific Theater. While European operations received most attention, gliders also served in the Pacific Theater, though under very different conditions. The vast distances, jungle terrain, and limited suitable landing areas in the Pacific created unique challenges for glider operations. Nevertheless, American forces developed and executed glider operations that demonstrated the versatility of these aircraft. The first significant glider operation in the Pacific occurred in March 1944, during the campaign in New Guinea. American forces needed to seize Japanese-held airfields deep in the jungle, far from Allied supply lines. Conventional overland advance would take weeks through difficult terrain. Parachute operations were considered, but the heavy equipment needed to construct airfields couldn't be delivered by parachute. Gliders offered a solution. Operation Thursday, as it was codenamed, involved landing gliders in small clearings hacked out of the jungle behind Japanese lines. Engineers and construction equipment would be delivered by glider, allowing rapid construction of airstrips that could then receive conventional transport aircraft. The plan was audacious, requiring gliders to land in confined spaces surrounded by tall trees, with no possibility of a second attempt if the first approach failed. The pilots selected for these missions underwent additional training in short-field landings and obstacle clearance. They practiced approaching landing zones with steep descent angles, using spoilers and slips to lose altitude rapidly while maintaining control. The gliders were loaded carefully to ensure proper weight distribution, as any imbalance could make the aircraft uncontrollable during the critical final approach. The operation succeeded beyond expectations. Gliders landed in clearings barely large enough to accommodate them, skidding to stops just short of trees or dropping into small ravines at the end of their landing rolls. Within hours, engineers were at work expanding the clearings and preparing them for conventional aircraft. The equipment delivered by glider, including bulldozers and grading equipment, enabled construction work that would have taken far longer using only hand tools. These jungle operations revealed new capabilities for gliders. The ability to deliver intact, functioning equipment to unprepared locations proved invaluable in the Pacific's island-hopping campaigns. Gliders could land on beaches, in jungle clearings, even on coral atolls, bringing in supplies and equipment that would otherwise require major logistical efforts to deliver. The most ambitious glider operation in the Pacific came during the recapture of the Philippines. In February 1945, American forces needed to rescue Allied prisoners of war held in camps behind Japanese lines. Some of these camps were located far from Allied positions, accessible only by difficult overland routes heavily defended by Japanese forces. Gliders offered a way to insert rescue forces rapidly and with the element of surprise. The raid on Los Baños prisoner of war camp demonstrated the flexibility of glider operations. On February 23, 1945, 9 C-47 transport planes towed gliders carrying elements of the 11th Airborne Division toward the camp, located about 40 miles behind Japanese lines. The landing zone was a field adjacent to the camp, barely large enough for the operation, but offering the advantage of immediate access to the objective. The gliders released at dawn and descended toward the field as paratroopers from the same division simultaneously dropped onto the camp itself from other aircraft. The coordination was precise. Paratroopers engaged Japanese guards while gliders were still descending. As the gliders skidded to stops, troops and jeeps poured out, racing toward the camp's gates. Within minutes, the raid force had overwhelmed the guards and was evacuating the more than 2,000 prisoners. The evacuation itself demonstrated another capability of glider operations. While the gliders themselves couldn't fly the prisoners out, they had brought vehicles that could transport them. The raid force loaded prisoners onto the vehicles and drove them to the shore of a nearby lake, where amphibious vehicles were waiting. The entire operation, from landing to complete evacuation, took less than 2 hours. Without gliders, such a raid would have been nearly impossible.
Burma also saw significant glider operations, particularly by British and American forces fighting against Japanese occupation. The terrain in Burma, mountainous, heavily forested, with few roads and limited flat areas, created immense logistical challenges. Gliders proved capable of reaching areas that were otherwise accessible only by difficult overland marches or risky parachute drops into jungle canopy. The Chindits, British special forces operating behind Japanese lines in Burma, received supplies and reinforcements by glider at various points during their campaigns. Gliders brought in mules, essential for carrying supplies in mountainous terrain, along with veterinary supplies, ammunition, and even small artillery pieces. The ability to land these resources intact and immediately available for use gave Chindit columns capabilities they couldn't have achieved through parachute supply alone. These Pacific operations, while smaller in scale than European glider assaults, demonstrated that gliders could operate effectively in diverse terrain and climates. From coral atolls to jungle clearings to rice padds, gliders proved adaptable to conditions that would have defeated many other delivery methods. The Pacific operations also highlighted the value of gliders for special operations, where the ability to deliver small, heavily equipped units directly to their objectives offered unique advantages.
Life and death in the gliders. The personal experiences of glider pilots and troops reveal the human dimension of these operations. Flying into combat in a canvas and wood aircraft, unable to maneuver evasively or fight back, required a special kind of courage. The men who climbed into gliders knew they were riding what some darkly called flying coffins, yet they did so mission after mission. The moments before casting off from the tow plane were filled with tension. Pilots checked instruments one final time, tightened their safety harnesses, and peered ahead trying to spot their landing zones. Troops in the cargo compartment sat silently, each dealing with fear in his own way. Some prayed, others checked weapons for the 100th time. Still others simply sat with eyes closed, conserving energy for the action to come. The intercom crackle, as the tow pilot announced 1 minute, sent a jolt of adrenaline through everyone aboard. The moment of release was distinctive, a sudden silence as the roar of the tow plane's engines faded, replaced by the rush of wind over the glider's surfaces and the creaking of its wooden structure. Pilots trimmed the glider for best glide performance, scanning ahead for landmarks and the landing zone. In combat conditions, this peaceful gliding phase rarely lasted long before the first signs of enemy fire appeared. Anti-aircraft fire was the glider pilot's nightmare. Unable to take evasive action without compromising the glide path to the landing zone, pilots could only maintain course and hope. The characteristic puffs of flak bursts, the sound of shrapnel tearing through fabric, the sudden shudder as metal fragments struck the airframe, these were experiences seared into every glider pilot's memory. Some gliders absorbed dozens of hits and kept flying, while others disintegrated after a single well-placed shell. Landings were the most critical moments. As the glider descended through the last 100 feet, pilots scanned for obstacles, poles, ditches, power lines, anything that could destroy the glider or kill its occupants. The ground rushed up, and pilots pulled back on the control stick to flare the glider, trading speed for lift to cushion the touchdown. The best landings were almost gentle, with the glider settling onto its skids with barely a jolt. More often, landings were violent affairs, with gliders bouncing, sliding, sometimes cartwheeling if they struck obstacles or rough ground. The sound of a glider landing, wood splintering, fabric tearing, metal scraping, was unforgettable. Troops were thrown against bulkheads despite their harnesses. Equipment broke loose and became dangerous projectiles. In the worst cases, the entire forward fuselage would collapse, killing or injuring pilots and troops in the front of the compartment. Yet within seconds of stopping, whoever could move was scrambling out, grabbing weapons and preparing for combat. Many glider pilots found the transition from aviator to infantryman jarring. Minutes earlier, they had been flying, exercising technical skills and judgment. Now, they were ground troops, their aviation expertise suddenly irrelevant as they took up rifles and joined the fight. Some pilots struggled with this dual role, feeling they had incomplete training for either task.
Others adapted quickly, using their organizational skills and leadership training to take charge of scattered troops and accomplish objectives. The casualty rates among glider pilots were sobering. Unlike bomber crews who could return to base after missions, glider pilots remained in the combat zone until ground troops linked up with airborne units or until they could be evacuated. They faced all the dangers of ground combat: artillery, small arms fire, armor, in addition to the hazards of their landing. In major operations, like Market Garden, pilot casualties approached 30%, a rate comparable to infantry units in heavy combat. Medical care for glider troops presented unique challenges. Medical supplies and personnel arrived with the gliders, but often in scattered locations. Severely wounded men required evacuation, but in most operations, no evacuation was possible until ground troops arrived. Medical officers and aid men performed surgery under fire, using whatever facilities they could improvise. Gliders themselves sometimes served as field hospitals, their cargo compartments converted to surgery wards. The psychological strain of glider operations was immense. Unlike parachute troops who jumped and then gathered with their units, glider troops experienced prolonged tension during the entire flight and approach. The helpless feeling of sitting in the cargo compartment, unable to see out or influence events, knowing that enemy fire could tear through the thin fuselage at any moment, wore on men's nerves. Some soldiers later admitted that the glider flight was more terrifying than the subsequent combat. Yet camaraderie among glider troops was intense. They had shared an experience that few others could understand: riding a fragile aircraft into combat, surviving the landing, and then fighting as infantrymen. Glider pilots and the troops they carried often formed bonds that lasted their entire lives. Reunion associations formed after the war brought together men who had shared these desperate moments, allowing them to process experiences that civilians could never fully comprehend. Individual stories of heroism were commonplace in glider operations. Pilots who guided crippled gliders to emergency landings, saving their passengers. Troops who fought their way out of gliders that landed in enemy positions. Medical personnel who treated dozens of wounded under fire. Officers who organized scattered troops and achieved objectives despite chaotic landings. These acts of courage, most never formally recognized, represented the true character of the men who flew the silent wings.
Innovation under fire. The combat experience with gliders drove continuous innovation and improvement. Problems identified in one operation led to modifications and new tactics for the next. This rapid evolution reflected both the urgency of wartime and the practical nature of the military organizations involved. If something didn't work, it was changed. If an idea promised better results, it was tested. One of the earliest modifications addressed the problem of landing impact forces. Initial glider designs, while structurally sound for normal landings, proved vulnerable to the hard landings common in combat conditions. Pilots couldn't always flare at exactly the right moment, and landing zones often had unexpected obstacles or rough spots. The solution came from an unexpected source: automotive technology. Engineers adapted hydraulic shock absorbers similar to those used in automobiles for installation on glider landing gear. These devices absorbed much of the landing impact, reducing the forces transmitted to the airframe and occupants. Combined with improved seating that allowed troops to brace properly for landing, these modifications significantly reduced injury rates. By 1944, most gliders featured these improvements, and casualty rates from landing impacts dropped noticeably. Another innovation addressed the challenge of landing in confined spaces. Pilots requested better control over descent rates during the critical final approach. Engineers responded by developing improved spoilers, larger panels that created more drag when deployed, allowing steeper descents without speed buildup. These modified spoilers gave pilots better tools for precision approaches into small landing zones surrounded by obstacles. Cargo loading procedures evolved significantly through combat experience. Early operations saw gliders loaded according to weight and balance calculations, but without sufficient consideration for rapid unloading under fire. After several incidents where critical equipment was trapped behind other cargo, loading procedures were standardized.
High-priority items were positioned for immediate access, with vehicles oriented so they could be driven straight out. Equipment was secured in ways that allowed rapid release of restraints rather than requiring time-consuming disassembly. Communications equipment underwent constant improvement. Early gliders had no radios or only simple receivers. Combat operations revealed the need for glider pilots to communicate with each other, with tow planes, and with ground controllers. Later gliders featured battery-powered radios that, while limited in range and duration, allowed coordination during landing approaches. Some gliders received signal equipment that allowed them to transmit identification signals, helping pathfinders and ground forces distinguish friendly gliders from enemy aircraft. Defensive measures were another area of innovation. While gliders couldn't carry heavy armor without severely limiting payload capacity, engineers experimented with lightweight protective measures. Pilot seats received armor plates to protect against ground fire during low-altitude approaches. Critical control systems received limited armoring or redundancy to ensure that single hits wouldn't make the glider uncontrollable. Some gliders featured self-sealing fuel tanks for the few models that carried fuel for vehicles as cargo. The British developed specialized gliders for specific missions. The Hamilcar tank carrier was the most visible example, but other modifications included gliders fitted with stretchers for medical evacuation, gliders configured as mobile command posts with extra communications equipment, and gliders adapted for carrying unusually bulky cargo like bridge sections or engineering equipment. This specialization allowed commanders to tailor glider loads to specific mission requirements. Tactical innovations were as important as technical ones. The concept of glider trains, multiple gliders releasing in rapid succession to land on the same landing zone, evolved through practice. Pilots learned to spiral down in a pattern that allowed each glider to land and clear the zone before the next touched down. This technique maximized the number of gliders that could use a limited landing area while minimizing the time between first and last arrival. Night operations drove numerous innovations. Pilots needed better instruments for formation flying and navigation in darkness. Phosphorescent paint applied to critical instruments allowed them to be read without cockpit lighting that would destroy night vision. Some gliders received crude night vision devices, essentially intensifying scopes that amplified available light. While primitive by modern standards, these devices gave pilots enough visibility to identify landing zones and major obstacles. Perhaps the most significant innovation was tactical rather than technical: the integration of glider operations with ground force operations. Early glider operations saw airborne forces dropped or landed ahead of ground forces, expected to hold objectives until relief arrived. Later operations integrated glider forces into the immediate battle plan, with ground and airborne forces advancing simultaneously or in close sequence. This integration, exemplified by Operation Varsity, proved far more effective than the extended isolation that characterized earlier operations. Training innovations kept pace with tactical developments. Flight simulators, crude by modern standards but revolutionary for their time, allowed pilots to practice emergency procedures and approaches without risk. Ground-based training incorporated increasingly realistic scenarios, including simulated enemy fire, obstacles, and navigational challenges. The most effective training innovation may have been the practice of mixed exercises, where glider pilots and ground troops trained together, building the mutual understanding essential for effective operations.
The German experience with gliders provides a contrasting perspective on airborne operations. Having pioneered military glider use at Eben Emael and Crete, German forces developed extensive defensive measures against Allied glider operations. Understanding the German perspective reveals both the effectiveness of glider operations and their limitations. German military analysts recognized gliders as a serious threat after their own successful operations. They studied American and British glider designs through captured examples and intelligence reports. German planners understood that gliders could deliver troops and heavy equipment with precision, creating strong points behind German lines that would be difficult to eliminate. The challenge was developing effective countermeasures. The Rommelspargel, or Rommel's asparagus,
fields of poles erected in potential landing zones represented the most visible German countermeasure. First Marshal Erwin Rommel ordered thousands of these obstacles installed across northern France in anticipation of Allied invasion. Some poles stood 20 feet tall with cables strung between them. Others had explosives attached, designed to detonate when struck by landing gliders. In some areas, entire fields became forest of poles that made glider landings nearly suicidal. Yet these obstacles had limitations. They required enormous resources to construct and maintain. Each pole had to be transported, erected, and secured against weather and sabotage. The scope of potential landing zones across occupied Europe meant that comprehensive coverage was impossible. German forces had to guess where Allies might land, creating concentrations of obstacles in likely areas while leaving others undefended. Allied intelligence identified many obstacle fields through reconnaissance, allowing landing zone selection to avoid the most heavily defended areas. German anti-aircraft forces adapted their tactics to counter gliders. Unlike powered aircraft that could maneuver to evade flak, gliders followed predictable glide paths once released from tow planes. German gunners learned to calculate these paths and concentrate fire along the descent corridors. The high concentration of flak encountered in Operation Varsity reflected this evolved defensive doctrine. However, the sheer number of approaching gliders often overwhelmed defensive positions, ensuring that many reached their landing zones despite losses. German ground forces developed rapid response tactics for dealing with landed glider troops. Infantry and armor units practiced quick reaction drills, racing to landing zones to engage airborne forces before they could organize and dig in. These tactics proved effective when German forces had warning and available reserves, as at Arnhem. However, glider operations that achieved surprise, like the Orne River bridges on D-Day, often secured their objectives before German forces could react effectively. Intelligence gathering became a priority for German forces. Resistance fighters, sympathizers, and captured personnel were questioned intensively about Allied airborne capabilities and intentions. German intelligence achieved some success in predicting general areas where airborne operations might occur, but the specific timing and locations remained difficult to forecast. The Allies' operational security, combined with deception operations, kept German forces uncertain about actual targets until operations began. German soldiers' accounts of encountering glider forces reveal a mix of respect and apprehension. The sight of massive gliders descending silently toward positions was described as eerie and unsettling. The rapid organization and aggressive action of landed troops impressed German commanders who recognized professional military capability when they encountered it. Some German reports noted that glider troops fought with particular intensity, perhaps reflecting their understanding that they had limited options for withdrawal or reinforcement. The psychological impact of glider operations extended beyond immediate tactical effects. German forces throughout occupied Europe had to maintain readiness for possible airborne assault, dispersing forces to guard potential landing zones and objectives. This defensive requirement tied down troops that might otherwise have been concentrated for offensive operations or mobile reserves. The mere possibility of glider operations influenced German strategic planning, validating the Allied investment in airborne forces. German forces captured numerous gliders intact or nearly so, providing opportunities for detailed technical assessment. These examinations revealed the simplicity and effectiveness of Allied glider design. German reports noted the emphasis on reliability and ease of manufacture rather than performance optimization. This philosophy, creating adequate aircraft that could be produced in large numbers quickly, impressed German analysts who saw their own forces struggling with shortages of complex, over-engineered equipment. Some German planning documents proposed expanded use of gliders in their own operations, but by the time these plans were developed, Germany lacked the resources and airspace control to execute them. The Luftwaffe's declining capability meant that towing aircraft couldn't be spared for glider operations, and Allied air supremacy made any attempted glider operations suicidal. German glider forces, which had begun the war as innovators, ended it unable to employ their own doctrine. The German experience ultimately validated the Allied approach to glider warfare. The defenses erected against gliders, while imposing costs on Allied operations, couldn't prevent determined and well-planned assaults from succeeding. The resources devoted to defending against glider operations subtracted from other defensive needs. Most significantly, German forces never found an effective counter to well-executed glider operations that achieved surprise and rapidly secured their objectives.
The final missions. As the war in Europe entered its final months, glider operations continued, but with changing character. The massive airborne assaults that had characterized earlier periods gave way to smaller, more focused operations. These final missions demonstrated the maturity of glider tactics and the proficiency of the crews and troops who executed them. Operation Choker, conducted in late March 1945, exemplified these smaller operations. British forces needed to seize crossings over the Isel River to support the Rhine crossing operation. Gliders delivered troops and equipment directly to objectives rather than to distant landing zones. The operation succeeded with minimal casualties, a testament to improved planning and execution based on accumulated experience. Resupply missions became increasingly important as Allied forces advanced across Germany. Airborne units that had landed days or weeks earlier required ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Gliders proved capable of delivering these supplies more effectively than parachute drops, as crates didn't scatter across wide areas and fragile items could be delivered intact. These missions, while less dramatic than assault operations, kept airborne forces effective in their holding roles. The final glider combat operation in Europe occurred in early May 1945, just days before Germany's surrender. A small force of gliders delivered supplies to isolated Allied units, finding landing zones in the chaotic landscape of collapsing German resistance. These last missions were anticlimactic compared to the great operations earlier in the war, but they demonstrated that gliders remained useful tools right to the end. In the Pacific, planning was underway for Operation Olympic, the planned invasion of Japan. Glider operations were integral to these plans, with thousands of gliders expected to deliver troops and equipment to secure objectives inland from invasion beaches. The scale of these planned operations dwarfed anything yet attempted, with landing zones surveyed and detailed plans developed. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, followed by Japan's surrender, ensured these operations never occurred. The end of combat operations left thousands of gliders scattered across Europe and the Pacific. Most were abandoned where they landed, considered too expensive to recover and no longer needed. Wood and fabric construction meant the gliders deteriorated rapidly when exposed to weather. Within years, most had rotted away or been scrapped for salvage. A few were recovered and preserved, but the vast majority simply disappeared, leaving behind only photographs and memories. Glider pilots faced an uncertain future as the war ended. Their unique skill set, combining aviation and infantry capabilities, had limited peacetime application. Most returned to civilian life, carrying experiences that set them apart but which few understood. The specialized nature of their training and service created a bond among veterans, leading to formation of associations and reunion groups that kept their story alive. The immediate post-war period saw military planners reassess airborne doctrine in light of wartime experience. Gliders had proven valuable, but with significant limitations. The advent of helicopters and improved parachute delivery systems offered alternatives that might prove more flexible and survivable. Within a few years, military gliders were obsolete, replaced by technologies that achieved similar objectives with less vulnerability. Technology and tactics in perspective.
The glider operations of World War II represented a unique intersection of available technology, tactical requirements, and operational innovation. Understanding why gliders emerged as important military tools requires examining the technological context of the 1940s. The alternatives available to military planners help explain both why gliders were developed and why they ultimately became obsolete. Parachute technology in the early 1940s was relatively primitive. Parachutes were reliable for delivering individual soldiers, but had significant limitations for equipment delivery. Heavy items required multiple parachutes and often suffered damage on landing. Vehicles couldn't be delivered by parachute at all, as the impact forces would destroy them. Artillery pieces, engineering equipment, medical supplies, all the materiel that transformed airborne troops from lightly armed raiders into capable combat units exceeded parachute delivery capabilities. Helicopters, which would eventually replace gliders for many missions, were in their infancy during World War II. The Sikorsky R-4, the first helicopter to see military service, entered production in 1942 but had minimal cargo capacity and limited range. Helicopters of the era could barely carry 2 people and had reliability problems that made them unsuitable for combat operations. The technology simply hadn't matured sufficiently to provide the heavy lift capability that gliders offered. Gliders thus filled a critical capability gap. They could deliver intact vehicles, heavy weapons, and large quantities of supplies that parachutes couldn't handle and helicopters couldn't carry. The trade-off, vulnerability during approach and one-way missions, was acceptable given the strategic value of the capability. Commanders chose gliders not because they were ideal, but because they were the best available solution to tactical problems. The tactical doctrine that evolved around gliders reflected both their capabilities and limitations. Planners learned to concentrate glider forces for maximum effect rather than dispersing them across wide areas. They developed techniques for rapidly organizing landed forces and securing objectives before defenders could respond. They integrated glider operations with other combat elements to ensure rapid link-up and support. This doctrine represented genuine innovation, not simply adaptation of existing airborne tactics. Glider operations demonstrated several principles that remain relevant in military planning. The importance of surprise and speed in the initial assault proved critical. Operations that achieved surprise and rapid consolidation succeeded. Those that allowed defenders time to organize typically faced severe challenges. The need for rapid link-up with ground forces became apparent through painful experience. Airborne forces, regardless of how they arrived, required ground force support within days, or they faced attrition and defeat. The influence of intelligence on operation success cannot be overstated. Operations based on accurate intelligence about landing zones, enemy dispositions, and objective locations generally succeeded. Operations launched with incomplete or inaccurate intelligence faced challenges that courage and skill couldn't always overcome. The relationship between intelligence quality and operational success was direct and measurable. Another enduring lesson concerned the relationship between technological capability and tactical effectiveness. The best-designed gliders and most skilled pilots couldn't overcome fundamental tactical disadvantages. Poor landing zone selection, inadequate suppression of defenses, or unrealistic objectives doomed operations, despite excellent execution of the aviation aspects. Technology enabled tactics but couldn't substitute for sound tactical planning. The integration of different military branches, aviation, infantry, armor, artillery, proved essential for successful glider operations. These were joint operations before jointness became military doctrine. The coordination required between pilots and troops, between airborne and ground forces, between planners and executors, foreshadowed modern military operations that routinely involve multiple services and capabilities. Glider operations also highlighted the importance of training and rehearsal. Units that trained extensively together, practicing specific missions repeatedly, performed far better than those thrown together for operations. The most successful operations, the Orna Bridges, aspects of varsity, involved units that had rehearsed their exact missions multiple times. The correlation between training intensity and combat effectiveness was unmistakable.
The human cost. Behind the statistics and strategic assessments lies the human cost of glider operations. Thousands of men died in gliders, either during landing or in the subsequent fighting. Many more were injured, some permanently disabled. The psychological cost, harder to quantify but no less real, affected survivors for decades. The casualty rates for glider pilots were sobering. In major operations, pilot losses approached 30%, comparable to bomber crews and far higher than most aviation roles. These weren't anonymous statistics, but individuals with names, families, and futures that ended in Norman fields, Dutch polders, or German forests. Each casualty represented training investments, lost expertise, and a family's grief. Troops carried in gliders faced similar risks. The landing itself could be deadly if the glider struck obstacles or crashed. Unlike paratroopers who landed individually and could take cover immediately, glider troops arrived in groups and had to exit the aircraft before dispersing. This concentration made them vulnerable to enemy fire during the critical first minutes after landing. Some gliders landed directly in enemy positions, their occupants killed or captured before they could effectively resist. The wounded presented particular challenges. Medical facilities and airborne operations were limited, consisting of what could be carried by combat medics and medical officers. Serious injuries requiring surgery had to be treated under field conditions, often under fire. Evacuation was impossible until ground forces arrived, meaning that wounded men had to endure extended periods without access to hospital care. The mortality rate for serious wounds was higher than for similar injuries sustained by troops with immediate access to medical evacuation. The psychological impact of glider operations extended beyond combat stress. The helpless feeling during the approach, unable to defend oneself or influence events, created a particular kind of anxiety. Survivors described the terror of sitting in the glider cargo compartment, hearing enemy fire strike the aircraft, wondering if the next round would penetrate the thin fuselage. This passive vulnerability created stress different than that experienced by infantry, who could at least shoot back. Post-traumatic stress, though not recognized or treated as it is today, affected many glider veterans. Nightmares of burning gliders, of friends killed during landings, of desperate fighting in the hours after landing haunted survivors. The intensity of glider combat, the sudden transition from relative safety in England to violent combat in minutes, provided no psychological buffer for processing the experience. Many veterans struggled with adjustment after the war, their invisible wounds unrecognized by a society that celebrated physical courage but didn't understand psychological trauma.